Let's take a close look at Academic Task 1. This is only for students taking the academic IELTS exam. Okay, so a quick reminder about what to expect for Task 1 on the academic IELTS. So you're going to write a response in 20 minutes. It's got to be 20 minutes or less. You really need to save the rest of your time for Task 2. Your response should be at least 150 words. As you're practicing, try to get more than 150, 175, 200, maybe 225. You don't want to be close to the minimum every time because your score is going to drop if you happen to go below that 150. What you're going to do in Task 1 is you're going to describe the most important features of a visual that they give you. Usually the visual is a chart or a graph. It could be a map or some type of diagram as well. They use many different kinds of visuals, but what you will do is to write a report about what you see. Sometimes they give you two visuals to compare or comment on. Your job in this section is to follow the directions closely and summarize the contents of the visual exam. You just need to report the most important features of the visual, and that's it. You don't need to comment on it or provide an opinion about it. In fact, you should not do that. You just write a report about the information you see. Okay, so Task 1 is very, very predictable. You should use the same strategy and structure every time you write a Task 1 response, because it will have the same outline for no matter what your visual is that you're looking at. Paragraph 1 of your report will just simply introduce the visual every single time. Paragraph 2 will describe the most important features of the visual. This section is really the most important part of your Task 1 response. Paragraph 3 and paragraph 4, you analyze a single important feature. Okay, so each paragraph has an analysis of one feature of the visual that you have. In this lesson, we're going to go through each of these 4 paragraphs, and I'll provide examples and tips about how to write each one. And we're going to use this sample question in order to practice writing a Task 1 response. What I want you to do right now is pause the video and read over the directions and look at the chart for this question. Go ahead and pause your video. Okay, so you've read over the directions and the chart. Notice how in the box we have information about the chart. Okay, it tells us what's happening on the chart, that we're looking at average sales between two companies over a 5-week period. Very important information letting us know what this chart is about. Then it gives us below that what we're supposed to do. And this will be basically the same directions on every Task 1. You just need to summarize the information, select and report the main features, and if relevant, make comparisons. Okay, it will be relevant to make comparisons between these two companies. So we will do that. All right, so let's talk about each of these sections and how to do well. So for your first paragraph where you introduce the visual, you'll need to write 1 to 3 sentences. Usually 2 or 3 sentences is about the right length. What you need to try to do is describe the purpose of the visual. You just need to say what this visual is trying to show. You also need to describe how the visual presents information, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. What you should avoid doing is using the same language as the prompt. So even though you're going to get most of your information that you will use from the directions and from language on the chart for this first paragraph in your report, you need to put it all in your own words. Okay, so the key thing, and this is true basically everywhere on the IELTS exam, is that you need to paraphrase. All right, so let's take a look at our sample question. Here is the key information we have about this chart. Okay, we also have key information here. And even though it describes it up above, this is important information as well. The days of the week, that we're talking about Australian dollars, and that what this chart is trying to do is show us average sales over a 5-week period between these two companies on each day. Okay, this gives us all we need to say for paragraph 1 of your report. So let's look at an example. Here I've written a sample paragraph 1 for you to look at. It says, the chart presents the average revenue collected by the Australian corporations A Corp and B Corp on each weekday. The average sales numbers, represented in Australian dollars, have been calculated using 5 weeks of earnings data. Okay, now what I want you to notice is that these words in blue are my attempts to paraphrase the language from the chart and from the directions. Notice that not 100% of the language is different, right? It's hard to find a different word for average, right? So we use that here below. But instead of saying sales, we say revenue. Instead of saying companies, we say corporations. Okay, averaged sales numbers is a different way, okay, of saying average sales. Earnings data, another way of describing what these companies earned. Okay, all of these things are new ways of saying the information that was presented in the directions. Notice also that the sentence structures are different in the example paragraph and in the directions. So, your goal is to take the information provided to you in the directions and on the chart that just represents the information about what this visual is trying to show, and you put it in your own words in 2 or 3 sentences. Then, after you have just provided that basic information about what the chart shows, then you need to describe some of its important features. For this second paragraph, you're supposed to write 2 to 4 sentences, and you just want to focus on the main features of the visual. So now you're not using anything from the directions and the description from the directions. You're looking at the visual and trying to describe what are some of the main features on this visual. You have to make choices in this part too. What's important? What's interesting? Okay, so you ask yourself, what information stands out to me most? Is there a trend that I'm looking at? Is there something that happens over time? Is there a process that goes from beginning to end? Are there themes in the information? These are questions you should ask yourself as you're looking at the visual. In this paragraph, you're not going to report specific, detailed information, numbers, figures, or percentages, things like that. You can save those for the next paragraphs. In this, you're just trying to report some of the most important features of the visual that you're looking at. So let's look at our visual again. So as we focus on the visual itself, what stands out to you? What do you notice right away, and what would be the most important feature you would want to report about? Well, to me, I would want to take a look at this earnings data and just very quickly try to figure out which company did better than the other company over this period. And I think you could really quickly, you wouldn't have to add up the exact numbers. You would see pretty quickly that A Corp did a little better than B Corp over this 5-week period, right? Another main feature is that I notice during the middle of the week, A Corp does much better than B Corp. Interestingly, B Corp does better than A Corp on Mondays and Fridays only. Okay? Another thing that really jumps out to me is that for some reason, B Corp on Tuesdays does very, very poorly. Okay, now remember, we don't need to report very specific information here. What we need to do in paragraph 2 is just discuss these general features that seem to be the most important part of this visual. So, here is one attempt to report on those features we just discussed. Go ahead and pause your video and read through this paragraph. Okay, so you've read the paragraph. You notice that we did not mention specific numbers. We just reported in our own words the most important features of that visual. Then, at the end of your report, this is where you can mention some interesting specifics that you notice in the visual. So what you should do for each of these paragraphs, so each paragraph 3 and 4 should have one important feature that you're focusing on, and that you describe that feature in detail. So you use specific data to tell that story. My advice is to find an angle. An angle is a perspective on the data that is interesting to you. I think for our example visual that we have in this lesson, one way you could get an angle would be to look at the most successful days for each company and the least successful days for each company. And that could be my angle. And what I would do is go back to the report and find some detailed, specific numbers to report about for those angles that I'm taking in each paragraph. For each of these paragraphs, you should write 3 or 4 sentences, as much as you can to get enough information in there. All right, so looking back at our chart, we can see easily the least successful days and the most successful days for both companies, right? We can report specific, we just have to go back and get those specific numbers. So we have to really focus on the numbers here, the dollar amounts, and make sure that we're collecting the correct information about the dollar amounts that each company earned. For my third paragraph, where I'm focusing on the most successful days, this could be an example paragraph. Again, go ahead and pause your video and read through this paragraph. Okay, you notice that we have detailed, specific numbers that we pull off the chart to report these most successful days. And that's what we will do for the least successful days. Obviously, B Corp's least successful days are here, but we'll also have to report about A Corp's least successful days. As we see, Friday was fairly unsuccessful for both companies compared to what they did on the other days of the week. Okay, so we can write our least successful days paragraph here and go ahead and read through that and pause your video one last time. Okay, so you've read through. Again, we use specific numbers to support our angle that we take for this paragraph. I've included this full essay in the comment section below for you to look at. You can copy and paste and print it if it helps you to look at it on paper. But this is a good example of a Task 1 report for the academic writing section. Some academic Task 1 writing prompts include diagrams. These are usually images, pictures of a process of some kind from beginning to end. Let's look at how to approach these questions so that you can be successful on your diagram Task 1 questions. First, let's look at some keys to success. So the first one, your goal for your overview paragraph is to summarize the entire process. So to be able to look at the process that's included in the diagram and try to describe it in very general terms from beginning to end. We're going to look at how to do that in just a moment. So that's your first challenge. And you have to be able to find the key activities, the key actions or stages in the diagram in order to represent them in some kind of summary. Secondly, then, you're going to have to usually describe the sequence of events that you see in the diagram from beginning to end. Okay, you want to figure out how you can put words to the images that you see in the diagram image. So let's walk through an example of how to do that and to look at what you should consider as you're trying to fulfill these two steps here. First of all, let's focus on how to summarize the entire process. Here we've got a sample image that is like one that you would find in Task 1 for your diagram question. And we've got up at the top here a label. So this is a 3-sink dishwashing process. Okay, how to wash dishes with 3 sinks. I suppose this is something you would find maybe in a professional restaurant or something like that as a way of making sure the dishes are very clean. So we see the stages moving from left to right. It starts over here with these dirty dishes and it ends way over at the right with the drying rack and all these stages in between. So for your overview paragraph, you need to be able to describe what you see here and generally what's going on from beginning to end in this process. All right, now I always like to have you kind of take a minute or two to sort of look at these things and think about what you would say if you had to summarize the overall process. So if you like to, go ahead and pause your video now, take a close look at this diagram here, and think about if you had to write 2 or 3 sentences describing generally what this image shows, what would you say for it? Go ahead and pause your video now and think about it. Okay, so what did you say for this one? Well, obviously we have to say something related to the title, right? This 3-sink dishwashing process. And we have to give some indication of what goes on from the beginning to the end of this process here. So let's look at an example overview to see how one way you could try to represent the activity in this diagram with words. Here's one that says, the diagram shows a method of cleaning dishes using 3 sinks. Overall, any remaining food is first removed and discarded from the dirty kitchenware, which is then cleaned in 3 separate basins before being set out to dry. Okay, so notice a few things. In this one, we describe the whole process, right? So from removing food all the way out to setting out the dishes to dry. So there's some general description of the activity that's there. And the first sentence way at the top, so the diagram shows a method of cleaning dishes. Here we have just a very simple description of what the whole diagram is about. Your challenge, of course, is to paraphrase. Try to paraphrase as much language as you can from the image itself and from the question prompt. It's just the same as all of the other Task 1 and even Task 2 prompts you get where you have language in the prompt that you need to put in your own words. So some attempts at that here. We've got kitchenware is one paraphrase that we have. Basins is another, right? A basin is another word for a sink. Okay, and there are a few other words as you go through, and compared to what's at the on the image, you'll notice some paraphrasing there as well. Okay, so a very general description of what's happening from beginning to end in our image. After we have our overview paragraph together, our general description, then we have to go through and describe the steps in the diagram you're looking at. Okay, now some IELTS Task 1 diagrams can be quite complicated, and there may be some details that you will choose to leave out because they seem like they're not as important as others. That's fine. But in general, you need to describe each step that you see. So you don't want to miss any steps in the process, whatever they're showing you. So from here, we need to have a description of everything from all the way from on the left where we have dirty dishes to the drying rack over on the right. Each stage in this needs a description, and we need to figure out a way to put what we see here into language. All right, so before we have some examples of that, let's talk about a couple of things to keep in mind. One good thing to try is to find a verb for each section of the image. What action do you notice going on in each stage, in each step of the process that you're looking at? You can really boost your score on these essay questions by finding really descriptive and accurate verbs to describe the actions that you see in the image. So focus on verbs. Think about, what verb really captures the action that I see going on in the image. Another piece of advice is that it's often best to use passive voice in this type of essay. You're describing a process. We usually don't know who is doing the action that you see in the image. It's not important who's doing it. It just describes a stage in a sequence of events. In order to put the focus on the action itself, on the activity, it's actually better, more descriptive to use passive voice constructions in your answers. In a moment, we'll look at some sample sentences and you'll notice the passive voice that we have there. As I'm sure you've studied before, the passive voice is created by using some form of the be verb. So am, is, are, was, were, plus a past participle verb. So an example would be something like a cookie was stolen from the cookie jar, right? That's passive voice. Was stolen. Stolen's the past participle form. And we have was, past tense of the be verb there. So that's the construction that works best for your diagram questions. That's mostly what you're going to want to use to describe the actions you see. Okay, lastly then, you need to avoid the trap of just writing activities, one after the other, actions in a simple list, according to what you see in the diagram. You need to make sure you're using words and phrases that connect the activities together. So transition words like first, second, third, last, okay? Those work well. You can also use phrases that sequence things together, like before the water is added to the second basin, it's heated to 75 degrees, something like that, okay? The phrases you use to show sequence and how those activities are connected together are a key to getting a really good score on your Task 1 essays that include diagrams. So focus on that. Now we're going to look at some sample sentences now for our sample diagram on dishwashing. If you want to see the full essay related to this diagram, look down below in the notes. The full essay is there. I'm just going to pull out a few sentences related to each of these steps that show some of the things that we need to be working on. Remember, we're looking for a good verb for each step in the process. We're going to use passive voice, and we're going to try to use transition words and phrases that show sequences of things so that we can connect the ideas together. So we've got our arrow here pointing to the part of the diagram we're looking at, and we'll look at some sentences that go through each stage here. All right, the first one, it begins down below. First, the dirty dishes are assembled and uneaten bits of leftover food are discarded in a compost bin. Okay, so that first step there, we've gathered the dirty dishes together and we've gotten rid of any food scraps. As it says on there, we've instead paraphrased that as uneaten bits. Notice the passive voice construction here, as we've discussed, are assembled, okay, and are discarded. The passive voice of both of these verbs. Okay, and our key verbs there that we're looking at, assembled and discarded, are two verbs that are very descriptive of what we see in this first part. Okay, the next one, we're moving on. So in the first sink, Then, okay, there's our transition word. The cookware is cleaned in the first sink, which contains soapy water. All right. Next, in the next step, the dishes are moved to a second basin. The water is heated, but does not contain any chemical additives. Okay, we know that the water's heated because we get that indication down here, but nothing like in the third basin. We've got this sort of bleach that's added here. And in the first basin, we have dishwashing detergent. So we see that in sink number 2, nothing like that is added. So that's notable for sink 2 and should be added to your description of what you see there. Right? Moving on then, the last sink contains water that's warm to at least 75 degrees. A cup of bleach is added to the third sink as well. Okay, more passive voice, more different verbs for each description of what we see there. Lastly, then, the dishes are placed on a rack to dry out. Okay, so from beginning to end, there's some sentences that pull out the major actions that you notice in each stage. Again, if you look down below, there's some detail added here so that we hit our word limit, but these are sample sentences to show you the grammar and the sequencing language that we need to get from beginning to end in this particular diagram. Okay, so to review, there are 2 main things to really focus on with these diagram questions. The first thing, we need to get our overview paragraph together, and to do that, we have to summarize the entire process. You need to sort of indicate what the diagram is about, and then from beginning to end, what does the diagram show? Okay, we saw an example of that for our dishwashing diagram. Then we need to go through and from beginning to end describe the stages, the steps involved. Okay, so you're supposed to, in this case, find a verb for each section of the image. So you have to describe each major part of the diagram. Again, some diagrams are very complicated. You might need to leave some small details out. That's okay. You have to decide if the detail's important or not, but you may not leave out any of the major steps in your description of the process. So find a verb, put that verb into passive voice to describe the action that you see, and then make sure you use transition words and phrases to avoid writing a simple list. You want to make sure that you are indicating the sequence of actions and how these activities relate to one another. These can be simple transition words or phrases that show how the actions connect together. All right, so that's a way to approach these diagram questions. And again, look at the example below if you want to see the full response for our dishwashing sample. This lesson focuses on Task 1 map questions that you get in the academic writing section. Let's take a look at how to approach this type of essay prompt. Okay, so we're going to organize this by thinking about questions you should ask yourself in order to help you organize your ideas, organize the information that you see in a map question that you might encounter. So the first thing, you always have to sort of think about what are you going to write about for your overview paragraph. Remember, that's this important paragraph where you provide a summary of the visuals that you see, no matter what they are, maps or charts or graphs or whatever it is. So you need to keep that same approach with map questions. And what you want to ask is, so what are the most significant changes between the 2 maps that you're presented with? Okay, so you're trying to look for some major differences between them. And possibly then, can you categorize these changes in order to report a sort of summary or overview of what you see in the maps? Okay, so let's take a look at some maps here. These are a sample of what you might find on the IELTS. We've got Rivertown in 1950 and 2000. And if you look at the maps here, pretty easy to see that there were changes made between these 2 time periods to the town itself. So if you'd like to, go ahead and pause your video now if you want to look at the different changes that are there and think about how would you categorize these changes? What summary would you make if you had to summarize the most important changes between 1950 and 2000 in Rivertown? Go ahead and pause your video and think about that for a moment. All right, so what did you come up with? Well, there are a lot of small changes around the town, okay? People's houses, people moved to different locations in the town, and, you know, there's some buildings and places in the year 2000 that weren't there in 1950. So how would you categorize these things? Well, for me, I think the significant trends between these two maps are down below. First of all, notice that they removed a lot of trees from 1950 to 2000. I suppose there's kind of a forest area, or at least a heavily wooded area in two parts of the town in 1950. We've got this area up here and also down here. Okay, so there were a lot of trees there before that are no longer in Rivertown, or at least there are far fewer trees and dedicated sort of forest area in 2000 compared to 1950. So that's one of the major trends I would notice. Secondly, there's an addition of a non-residential zone near the river. Okay, we're talking about this place that used to be kind of a forested area over here. Now there's a hospital, museum, and mall. Okay, I don't notice there are no houses there, at least no houses indicated on the map. So we're calling this would be a non-residential area where businesses and other things exist. Okay, so that would be a major change that I would point out. The last thing, the population is more dense. Notice how there is, first of all, in year 2000, there's an apartment complex. That suggests there are quite a few people living there. Okay, it used to be a fisherman's shack over there in 1950. Now there's an apartment complex, and there are some more houses around. Okay, so we could say that the population is a little more dense in Rivertown in 2000 compared to 1950. Okay, these are the three major things I would point out. Maybe you found some other way to categorize these things. That's fine, but to me, these are the major trends that I notice. Okay, now, in the first part of this essay, remember, we're supposed to come up with an overview paragraph of these things. So here's a sample. Using what I found to be the most significant changes between these two maps. It says, in general, the maps show that Rivertown has replaced several forested areas with residential and non-residential developments between the years of 1950 to 2000. Okay, so the removal of forested area for development is the major change that I would point out for my overview paragraph for these two maps. All right, then in the remainder of the essay, you would simply describe some of these things in more depth, describing how in this area up here, okay, what used to be forested area is now occupied by other things like a large school, houses have been built up there. So those are the details then that you would describe in the remainder of the essay. Okay, now a second consideration. We've thought about this overview paragraph. A key to success on these map questions is focusing on time. Okay, what makes these difficult for many students is and what can pull down many student scores is that time is difficult to describe sometimes on these maps because we have different relationships that are possible between the two maps that you are presented with. So we might have, as we saw before, Rivertown represented as in 1950 and the year 2000. Okay, so two snapshots of this town and its layout in the past. Okay, both of these are in the past. So we need to make sure that the language we use accurately describes that, okay, in order to get full points, not only for grammar, but for the logic of what you say. So, right, your coherence and cohesion score as well will depend on accurate representation of the time. So sample sentence down below. The school was near the river, but it was moved closer to Sam's house and expanded by 2000. We are using the past here to indicate these actions, what occurred in these past times. All right, now what about a different situation? What if we have on the left here with a map with Rivertown in 1950, but on the right we're thinking about Rivertown in the present. Okay, so our tenses and our description of time has to change in this case. We have to focus on it so that our descriptions make sense. Down below we've got a sample sentence there. What was once a wooded area near the river is now a non-residential zone that includes a hospital, museum, and mall. We can use present tense now because these changes are current, and that's what the town currently looks like. We have to stay consistent. You have to use that grammar throughout your essay and use it appropriately so that the time makes sense. All right, the last example here. Imagine we have a map maybe in the past or the present. Sometimes they present you maps that are in the future, okay? A projection, some changes that will occur, all right? So in that case, we would think about it this way. Down below, we've got our sample. By 2025, the wooded area near the river will be removed to make way for a hospital, museum, and mall. All right, we have to focus on this type of language in these maps. It's very important, especially as you're in your paragraphs that come after your overview, where you're describing the details of the maps and what changes and how they're different from one another, that you focus on the time and don't lose points because you've represented the time inaccurately. Okay, so to review, the most difficult part of these map questions for most students is just thinking about how to summarize and write an overview paragraph that presents the most important changes that occurred. So as we saw, what you should try to do is try to locate those major changes and then see if you can categorize them in some way. For our maps on Rivertown, we saw that, the major trend was to remove forested area and include more development there with apartments, but also with non-residential development, that mall and the hospital that was there. Okay, so that was the major trend, and that's what we wrote for our overview paragraph. Okay, then as you continue on, you just follow the same strategy for all Task 1 essays where you write the details of those changes. So that's where you would include a description of, okay, well, the apartment building moved and the hospital was constructed and several people's houses moved from one area to the other. Okay, you get into the details to report about those changes in the following paragraphs, but your overview is your big challenge on these map questions, trying to figure out what to write. So we saw how to do that. And then your second challenge as you're writing those details is to focus on time and to use appropriate tenses in particular so that your response represents the changes as they occurred or as they will occur across time. Okay, so that's how to approach these Task 1 map questions. When you respond to academic Task 1 prompts that include charts, graphs, and tables, you have to make decisions about what information is most important to report about. That can be a challenge. So we're going to look at some examples of these kinds of visuals and think about what it is you should pull out from them and report about in your essay that you write for these Task 1 prompts. Okay, so let's take a close look at these. First of all, when you come to a prompt that includes charts, graphs, or a table, you want to ask yourself these questions first. What is the purpose? Okay, what is the purpose of this visual that I'm looking at? What is it trying to communicate? Okay, that information is going to be key, especially for your overview paragraph that you write, where you have to kind of summarize what's in this visual in general terms. So look for that. find the purpose of the visual. Most of the time you can find that information in the title. There's going to be usually a title to the visual you're looking at, and possibly some of the labels that are there on the visual itself should indicate what the purpose is. Look to that first. Try to understand that right away as you're looking at a visual. You also want to note the units of measurement. Okay, are they using money as a category? Some kind of percentage of something? Is it weight? Is it distance? What is it? Okay, I know many students circle the units so that they keep them in mind and they don't forget about them as they're writing, because it can pull your score down if you report about the units represented in an incorrect way. Okay, so be careful about that. Look for time as well. Time is often a feature of these visuals, how things change or how things, increase or decrease or whatever it is they're looking at over time. So note the time. Is it years? Is it minutes? What is it? And note that carefully so you report about those things accurately. Okay, now this isn't usually a very complicated part of the process, right? That information is usually provided for you very clearly on the visuals. You just want to make sure that that's your first step, that you look at it carefully. The more challenging thing is then to take a look at the visuals and try to make decisions about what is it that's most important for me to report about, okay? And that can be a bigger challenge, not only in your overview paragraph, but then making decisions about detailed information that you would want to write about. So what we're gonna look at in the remainder of this lesson is thinking about the key features, the most important information that you are likely to find on these visuals, and that you would want to pull out and discuss in your essay. And basically, we can identify these things as 4 different features of these visuals that you're likely to find. You're going to find that they show certain trends, milestones, changes, and contrasts. Okay, so we're going to look at some sample visuals that represent each of these 4 categories here, and just get some ideas about how to report about them. Now, I'm going to provide some sample sentences in this lesson, but if you look down below in the notes, you can see some more language there that's going to be useful for you to describe each of these 4 features. Okay, so look down below in the notes for some more language you can study and utilize as you're describing each of these things. Okay, let's start with this first visual that we have here. Now we're looking at, in general, our basic information. We're looking at Brainberry Island carbon emissions, and the time represented here is 1990 to 2005. Okay, so there's where we get some of our basic key information. Down below, we've got the units. Okay, we've got carbon emissions, and we've got units from 0 to 3 there, and those represent metric tons. Okay, so here would be 2 metric ton level. Okay, and we've got the time, of course, across the bottom. Okay, so that was our key information, the first sort of basic stuff we look at when we come to the visual. Okay, now as we look at this visual, we want to think about what is the key information we would want to pull out and describe in our essay for this particular visual. Well, this visual is a nice example of our first category, which is trends. Okay, this one shows a trend. The trend it shows is a rising trend over time. Okay, a trend is basically just the general direction something is moving. Okay, so in general, we can say that from 1990 to 2005, carbon emissions had an increasing trend. Okay, it was rising over that period. Now, there were some exceptions, right? We've got some declines here in 3 spots, okay? So that would also be part of the overall trend that we notice and that we would want to describe in our report about this particular visual. Okay, so some sample language here we would use for this particular one. The chart shows a steady rise in carbon emissions during this time period, or overall carbon emissions increased at a constant rate. Okay, so it was increasing regularly as a general trend over this period, and only 3 years saw a minor decline. Okay, this would be the kind of information you would want to report about. Of course, then as you get into the details of the minor declines, you could discuss the years and sort of give a general sense of how much things decreased during this time period. You could also describe in depth, the general trend of, particular years where the increase was more than others, or where it was flatter or less distinct than other years. Okay, you would get into the details as you describe this, but the key part of this visual is simply to notice that this trend has been occurring steadily since 1990 and on through 2005, at least in this chart. Okay, so this is a good example of how a trend can be the key information you would want to report about and provide details about then in your sort of paragraphs 2 and 3 and possibly 4 as you describe the details related to this information. Okay, so that's our first category, trends. Now, we see some trends in this one as well, okay? Here we've got sea lion and harbor seal populations in the Pacific Northwest, okay? And the time period here is 1995 to 2015. We've got their population numbers over here on the left side, and we've got the time represented at the bottom. So we do have some trends here. In general, I would say, we've got a general pattern of this falling and rising. So we could report about that as the key information, and that would be perfectly fine to report about that trend that you notice here. In addition to that, or as a different way of approaching this particular visual, we could talk about the milestones. The milestones you notice. The milestones are the peaks, the highest points, the lowest points, the instances where something reached the maximum or the minimum is usually going to be a kind of milestone. So we have a few milestones that we could note on this particular visual. We've got one over here, one over here. Those are the highest points of these populations over time. And we've got the milestones, the sort of low points that are down in particular here. Those could also be key things to report about as the important information from this visual. Okay, so a milestone, the sort of extremes of the visual that you're seeing, will sometimes be the information you want to pull out and report about for your essay. Okay, so some sample language here. Harbor seal and sea lion populations peaked in 1995 and 2015. Okay, so the peak is the highest point, right? We could also report about how the sea lion population in particular hit its lowest point around 2001. Okay, this again, these peaks and valleys or low points are significant information that you should pull out and report about on many of the visuals you see. Okay, so second category here, milestones. Again, look down below. You can see some more language to help you report about the milestones you see in your visuals you're looking at. Okay, a third category here, we can report about significant changes that we notice. Changes represented in the visuals. Here we've got a table. We've got average seasonal rainfall in Bernard County over each decade from 1950 to 2010. So we've got some units of time there. We've got these seasons reported down below, and we've got the decades we're looking at here. Our units are inches of rainfall, okay? So we have to take a look. You might have to study this for a minute to look at what changes occurred. Were there general patterns that were significantly altered at some point? Well, if you look for a while, you'll notice that yes, there were. We can notice a change here here, and in particular here as well, okay? So the general trends that we saw before 1980 was that in the summer, the rainfall was pretty steady. Around 1.8, 1.9, 1.7 inches. Okay, there wasn't much change for this time period. Suddenly, though, something occurred in the decade of 1980 to 90 where summer rainfall has started to go into decline. It started a new trend. So we can report about the trend. We should describe that in some way, but we could note as a key part of this table the change that occurred, okay, during this time. And we could categorize some of these changes. There's a similar change for the fall season, which is that in 1990, rainfall numbers also began to decline significantly, such that by 2000 to 2010, the number was quite a bit lower than it had been, up around 3.5, 3.9 inches. We're all the way down to 2.5 inches in that decade. So overall, the change was that summer and fall rainfall significantly declined, and those changes began around 1980, 1990 range. Okay. In the winter, the rainfall actually increased, okay, and that change began possibly here, I guess. We could say it started here as well, okay, so the 1980s, we started getting a little more rainfall, and that increased dramatically, so that by 2000 to 2010, we were getting much more rain. So that trend started going upward. The change occurred in 1980 to 90. Okay, so we would want to report the change that was noted. Now, we don't know why this is happening. There's no information to explain the change. We just need to describe the change in some way. So one way to report about this, a sample sentence below, just about summer rainfall. Summer rainfall totals were in decline beginning in the 1980s and had diminished significantly by the decade of 2000 to 2010. Okay, noting the significant change that began in the 1980s for summer rainfall. We could create similar sentences for fall, and then an opposite report about winter where the change occurred in the 1980s for an increasing amount of rainfall in that period. All right, so note the changes. What changes occurred? That will be information to pull out and report about on the visuals you see. That's the key information. Okay, a final category here, we've got contrasts. Many of your Task 1 visuals will show some kind of contrast, which is where you see two things beside each other that are very different in some way, okay, and strikingly different, okay, so that difference is something that will often be a feature to report about. We've got a very simple visual down below. This one would be accompanied by a table of some kind or a second visual. They like to do that on your Task 1 questions. But this one does show a nice contrast that you would certainly want to pull out and report about. And that is that the saltwater and freshwater our percentages are so different, right? There's a huge contrast between the amount of the globe that is filled with salt water and the amount of fresh water that we have. Okay, so we could report about that information as a key feature. Most of the globe is covered by water, but only a very small percentage of that is fresh water. Okay, so that contrast is something to note, and you will often find these kinds of contrasts on your Task 1 visuals. Again, to report about contrasting information, look down below. There's lots of information for you down there, lots of sample sentences and vocabulary for you to point out contrasting features of your Task 1 visuals. Okay, so to review, when you come to a Task 1 prompt that has charts, graphs, tables, you ask just the basic information first. You try to determine what's the purpose of the visual, what are the units of measurement I'm looking at, and how is time represented on the visual, if at all. Usually there's some kind of time component on many of your Task 1 visuals. Okay, so you need to note that. Again, I think it's a good strategy to circle, especially the units of measurement that you're looking at on your visual. But then you want to look at your visuals and try to make determinations about what are the key features you want to pull out and report about from them. And in general, we can say that the key information, the stuff that's going to be most important to report about, are going to belong to one of the 4 categories we looked at. You're going to try to identify trends. Okay, so how patterns of things either rising or declining or staying steady over time, those are trends usually over time that you want to find. Milestones are the peaks or the low points, okay? The highest, the worst, whatever it is that you're looking at, whatever category it is, noting the places where it reached its highest or its lowest point is often something to pull out and describe in your Task 1 essays. You want to find changes. What are the points when something was going one way but then took a different direction? That will be a key feature to pull out. And the last one, contrasts. When you put 2 things or more beside one another, when one thing is so much bigger or smaller than the other things that you're comparing it against, that's a contrast. That is key information that you will want to pull out from the visuals you're looking at. Okay, so hopefully this will help you to make decisions about what information you should pull out from your Task 1 prompts that include graphs, charts, or tables.